CTMU, the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe by Langan. And the way we'll do this is I will probably go ahead and do most of the reading, and maybe I'll take a break after one of the section breaks, and someone else can jump in. And yeah, jump in wherever, because there's going to be a lot of neologisms that Langan uses. And I also have, in a different window, actually, let me update the stream real quick, because I'm actually going to make it so you guys can see when I pull up the wiki, just in case. Actually, I already have that pulled up. But yeah, alright. I'll start with the abstract. Inasmuch as science is observational or perceptual in nature, the goal of providing a scientific model and mechanism for the evolution of complex systems ultimately requires a supporting theory of reality of which perception itself is the model, or theory to universe mapping, where information is the abstract currency of perception. Such a theory must incorporate the theory of information while extending the information concept to incorporate reflexive self-processing in order to achieve an intrinsic, self-contained description of reality. This extension is associated with a limited formulation of model theory identifying mental and physical reality, resulting in a reflexively self-generating, self-modeling theory of reality identical to its universe on the syntactic level. By the nature of its derivation, this theory, the Cognitive Theoretic Model of the Universe, or CTMU, can be regarded as a super-tautological reality theoretic extension of logic. And as far as I understand his use of super-tautology, it's essentially tautology, so something that is kind of self-verifying, something that is absolutely true by necessity, by virtue of the way that the logic is constructed. Uniting the theory of reality with an advanced form of computational language theory, the CTMU describes reality as a self-configuring, self-processing language, or SCSPL, a reflexive, intrinsic language characterized not only by self-reference and recursive self-definition, but full self-configuration and self-execution, reflexive read-write functionality. SCSPL reality embodies a dual-aspect monism consisting of infocognition, self-transducing information residing in self-recognizing SCSPL elements called syntactic operators. So yeah, it doesn't take very long for him to get right into that, but self-configuring, self-processing. I really like the use of self-definition because it kind of, like the whole SCSPL idea, and I might as well go ahead and pull this up because it will be, we'll go ahead and expand on this. SCSPL is the meta-mathematical structure to which the universe is isomorphic. SCSPL is the language of the universe, a language so expressive that the universe creates itself and evolves through using it. So yeah, it's kind of like the mode by which the self-definition is actually occurring, which ties into his concept of
It's like self-conditioning, right?
Yeah, I would say that, yeah. Which ties into his infocognition. And I'll go ahead and read this because he's going to introduce a lot of neologisms, and we're just going to kind of help get a grasp on them by reading the wiki. Normally, languages are considered to be in the minds of people, and they work on the basis of moving symbols around mentally, where said symbols represent things in the outside world. By attempting to represent things in the outside world with language, one gets closer and closer in accuracy of description to the things one attempts to describe, the more expressive/powerful the language is. What would happen if a language was so expressive that it contained every piece of information of the thing it wishes to describe to the highest resolution possible? You'd have the SCSPL coding of that object in the universe, which is identical to the object itself. Thought about in another way, if one asks themselves, what does the SCSPL coding of a tennis ball look like? The answer is the tennis ball itself. Other languages that SCSPL provides a syntactic covering for, see descriptions of syntactic covering and human cognitive syntax, include the laws of physics, the laws of mathematics, the expressions of the human mind, or HCS. According to the reality principle, the universe is self-contained, and according to infocognitive monism, it regresses to a realm of nil constraint, unbound telesis, which kind of reminds me of the indefinite dyad, from which it must refine itself. Yeah, basically.
We were talking about that the other day.
Yeah. According to the telic principle, yeah, so a lot of times in the definitions themselves, there's other things that are probably worth getting into. He'll probably get into tellers later on in the CTMU itself, so we'll just look at it then. Where did I leave off? Okay. Which states that the universe must provide itself with the means to do this. It must make and realize its own choice to exist by reason of its absolute priority. This act of choice is identical to that which is chosen, i.e. the universe itself, and thus reflexive. I'll stop there, but something interesting about this is I think he will later in this text kind of disagree with Kant, in that Kant kind of maintains that the objects of perception, well, one of his central ideas is kind of doubt of its accuracy, given the fact that it passes through a perceiver, and the perceiver that's probably, or the object of perception could be, changed by the subject's perception thereof. But what Chris kind of seems to be getting into here is that the language, which is represented as kind of in a Schopenhauerian vein, the image is actually identical to the code of that thing, or at least some kind of rendering of that thing. All right, continue on. I'll probably be doing that quite a bit, so this might be a little bit slow. Whoops. Okay. I will restart here. SCSPL, reality, embodies a dual aspect monism consisting of infocognition, self-transducing information, residing in self-recognizing SCSPL elements called syntactic operators. Infocognition, pretty straightforward. Information cognition, because that seems to be the dual aspect that he's talking about. It's both the cognition and the information, because the kind of object that the SCSPL is producing, that kind of self-definition is essentially identical to information itself. The CTMU identifies itself with the structure of these operators, and thus with the distributive syntax of its self-modeling SCSPL universe, including the reflexive grammar by which the universe refines itself from UBT, a primordial realm of infocognitive potential free of informational constraint. So this would be like if the information itself, or the definition mentioned earlier, is kind of like the limit applied, well, kind of not only from the unbound telesis, or this kind of indefinite principle, but also like the image kind of mapped off of, if we were to think this in Platonist terms, how the one is both, or you have the monad and the indefinite dyad. The monad would in a sense be definite, or the one would in a sense be definite, because it is, and it has a way that it is, or at least the monad, and in that way it is definite. And there's also the indefinite aspect, and things can be mapped onto the way that reality is. So even base reality is, in a sense, kind of definite. So, a primordial realm of infocognitive potential, free of informational constraint. I just mentioned that because of the word constraint. kind of brings to mind limit. Under the guidance of a limiting intrinsic form of anthropic principle called the telic principle, SCSPL evolves by telic recursion, jointly configuring syntax and state while maximizing a generalized self-selection parameter and adjusting on the fly to freely changing internal conditions. So telic recursion, as far as I understand it, is a kind of feedback. So if you were to think of it, I believe his equivalent to souls or Leibniz's monads are referred to as tellers or telons. One of them is like the object that they subscribe to. I believe telons are the objects subscribed to by tellers. I might have it backwards though. So if they were to inhabit a state or a condition, this inhabitants and their kind of interaction therewith and their development of these conditions, of this information, their participation in that information, would kind of feed into this recursion into the whole language itself. SCSPL relates space, time, and object by means of conspansive duality and conspansion, which is something I've actually never fully understood with CTMU's conspansion. Real quick, let's go ahead.
Yeah, I was about to say, pull it up on the wiki.
Yeah, and if there's any terms that you guys want me to look into on the wiki, feel free to chime in. Conspansion is the alternating process by which reality evolves. Conspansion is so called because it involves material contraction during space expansion. Okay. Material contraction is what the objects in the universe are undergoing from a global vantage. Each future state is being injected into the previous state, and everything is shrinking within its own boundaries, along with the measurement metric for space-time. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. Kind of brings to mind, like, if a condition were to be developed, like let's say the condition that your soul was inhabiting and the past was not like a reified fabric that necessarily exists as itself, or as we conceive of past and future, or how like popular science fiction conceives of timelines, then it would make sense that the condition that is inhabited would potentially rewrite even the memory. Or we could say that past exists as a memory. Memory would be reference to the condition inhabited. And I'm kind of referring to a lot of my own modeling here. But I think it goes really well with the CTMU, actually. And hopefully helps to explain this. But yeah, if you were to develop that condition, it would make sense that because the past doesn't exist in itself, and that memory is just a reference to condition, that it would indeed kind of inject into the previous state, as said here. Although I'm sure when he's talking about the contraction of material and this expansion of space, he's getting into like just straight up physics. And I have heard of that a little bit, but I'm not super flushed out on that. Does anyone know what that's about? You can chime in. The dual relationship. Actually, I'm gonna have a drink of water if anyone wants to chime in on that. Good time for it. The dual relationship between these two vantages is called conspansive duality. Actually, okay, let's see if that's a little more helpful. On the surface, conspansive duality says that there's no difference between the expansion of the universe with respect to its contents and the contraction of its contents with respect to it. Okay, so that's why he kind of combines the terms. Roughly speaking, conspansion has reality undergoing a two-step process of self-creation. The first step involves reality considering all the information it currently holds and all future and past possibilities in its own values, then restructuring a present state from all that. It is a descriptive phase of reality where it manipulates the underlying language that describes reality, the SCSPL, The second phase of the process involves the present literally coming into being and some object form that you can point at, a form in which reality physically contains objects. When speaking about reality as a whole, these two phases are called incoversion and coinversion. Okay. Phases of descriptive containment and topological containment. By the very nature of constantly descriptively containing itself, topologically containing itself, descriptively containing itself. Okay. Just repeat it. Okay. And so on. And yeah, so you guys should think of this as not only kind of like a reading of the CTMU, but because I'll be reading a lot of the, elaboration on the terms, which I don't think there is going to be that much in the text itself, as kind of a general CTMU study group. But yeah, the material objects in the universe are shrinking into themselves while the boundaries of the universe remain fixed. Oh, you know what? I've actually heard people in Ken Wheeler circles talking about this in reference to the idea that the universe is just continually expanding, that it's rather the case that the information we're perceiving is contracting, which creates the appearance of expansion. So that kind of reminds me of that.
I think there's a guy, Donald Hoffman. I can't remember if that's his name correctly. I think he talks about that.
I'm sure he does. He's a pretty popular idealist. I follow him on Twitter. Yeah. Each future state of an object is injected into its previous state. Okay. If coversion and coinversion are the global processes of topological and descriptive containment, then inner expansion and requantization are the processes happening at the local level. Inner expansion involves objects, syntactic operators, hollowing out their current insides, interacting with one another, and then mutually absorbing information from each other to create future states inside their individual previous states. They inject their future states into their previous ones or inner expand. Okay, we'll just continue with that. I think that's sufficient. I have to start highlighting this. Okay, telic recursion, we went with conspansion. Okay, an SCSPL grammatical, let's go ahead and do that, process featuring an alternation between dual phases of existence associated with design and actualization and related to the familiar wave-particle duality of quantum mechanics. By distributing the design phase of reality over the actualization phase, conspansive spacetime also provides a distributed mechanism for intelligent design, adjoining to the restrictive principle of natural selection, a basic means of generating information and complexity. Addressing physical evolution on not only the biological but cosmic level, the CTMU addresses the most evident deficiencies and paradoxes associated with conventional discrete and continuum models of reality, including temporal directionality, accelerating cosmic expansion, while preserving virtually all of the major benefits of the current scientific and mathematical paradigms. All right. Pretty dense abstract. Actually, I think the abstract will probably be a little more difficult than the intro, so hopefully this is a little more clear. Introduction. Among the most exciting recent developments in science are complexity theory, the theory of self-organizing systems, and the modern incarnation of intelligent design theory, which investigates the deep relationship between self-organization and evolutionary biology in a scientific context, not preemptively closed to teleological causation. Bucking the traditional physical reductionism of the hard sciences, complexity theory has given rise to a new trend, informational reductionism, which holds that the basis of reality is not matter and energy, but information. Unfortunately, this new form of reductionism is as problematic as the old one. As mathematician David Berlinski writes regarding the material and informational aspects of DNA, we quite know what DNA is. It is a macromolecule and so a material object. We quite know what it achieves, apparently everything. Are the two sides of this equation in balance? More generally, Berlinski observes that since the information embodied in a string of DNA or protein cannot affect the material dynamic of reality without being read by a material transducer, information is meaningless without matter. The relationship between physical and informational reductionism is a telling one, for it directly mirrors Cartesian mind-matter dualism, the source of several centuries of philosophical and scientific controversy regarding the nature of deep reality. As long as matter and information remain separate, with specialists treating one as primary while tacitly relegating the other to secondary status, dualism remains in effect. To this extent, history is merely repeating itself. Where mind and matter once vied with each other for primary status, concrete matter now vies with abstract information abstractly representing matter and its extended relationships. But while the formal abstractness and concrete descriptiveness of information seems to make it a worthy compromise between mind and matter, Berlinski's comment demonstrates its inadequacy as a conceptual substitute. What is now required is thus: what has been required all along, a conceptual framework in which the relationship between mind and matter, cognition and information, is made explicit. Seems like the part of the problem with the quote up here is that it's kind of just an observation of efficient causes, like we read in Leibniz last week. There's no real final cause. It kind of is just still, like, if you were to kind of just give a primacy of information, it would be essentially the same as materialism, but with this kind of disguise of idealism, where you're kind of just conceiving of materiality in a different way, but really much the same way, just masquerading differently. What is now required is thus what has been required all along, a conceptual framework in which the relationship between mind and matter, cognition and information is made explicit. This framework must not only permit the completion of the gradual, ongoing dissolution of the Cartesian mind-matter divider, but the construction of a footworthy logical bridge across the resulting explanatory gap. Mathematically, the theoretical framework of intelligent design consists of certain definitive principles governing the application of complexity and probability to the analysis of two key attributes of evolutionary phenomena: irreducible complexity and specified complexity. On one hand, because the mathematics of probability must be so causally interpreted to be scientifically meaningful, and because probabilities are therefore expressly relativized to specific causal scenarios, it is difficult to assign definite probabilities to evolutionary states in any model not supporting the detailed reconstruction and analysis of specific causal pathways. On the other hand, positing the absolute improbability of an evolutionary state ultimately entails the specification of an absolute, intrinsic global model with respect to which absolute probabilistic deviations can be determined. A little reflection suffices to inform us that some of its properties, it must be rationally derivable from a priori principles and essentially tautological in nature. It must on some level identify matter and information, and it must eliminate the explanatory gap between the mental and physical aspects of reality. Furthermore, in keeping with the name of that to be modeled, it must meaningfully incorporate the intelligence and design concepts, describing the universe as an intelligently self-designed and self-organizing system. How is this to be done? In a word, with language. This does not mean merely that language should be used as a tool to analyze reality, for this has already been done countless times with varying degrees of success. Nor does it mean that reality should be regarded as a machine language running in some kind of vast computer. It means using language as a mathematical paradigm unto itself. Of all mathematical structures, language is the most general, powerful, and necessary. Not only is every formal or working theory of science and mathematics by definition a language, but science and mathematics in whole and in sum are languages. Everything that can be described or conceived, including every structure or process or law, is isomorphic to a description or definition and therefore qualifies as a language. and every sentient creature constantly affirms the linguistic structure of nature by exploiting syntactic isomorphism to perceive, conceptualize, and refer to it. Even cognition and perception are languages based on what Kant may have called phenomenal syntax, with logic and mathematics counted among its most fundamental syntactic ingredients. Language defines the very structure of information. This is more than an empirical truth, it is a rational and scientific necessity. All right. Of particular interest to natural scientists is the fact that the laws of nature are a language. To some extent, nature is regular. The basic patterns or general aspects of structure in terms of which it is apprehended, whether or not they have been categorically identified, are its laws. The existence of these laws is given by the stability of perception. Because these repetitive patterns or universal laws simultaneously describe multiple instances or states of nature, they can be regarded as distributed instructions from which self-instantiations of nature cannot deviate. So this kind of seems, both of this and up here when he's talking about the syntactic isomorphism, seems to kind of play into the thing I said about Kant earlier, kind of seems to contradict the whole casting the perception of the subject, or of the object by the subject, into doubt, because Langan is kind of predicating an isomorphism, probably by way of a necessary common syntax between the subject and the object. Moving on from there, regulates its self-instantiations. And it would make sense, actually I didn't read that part, whoops. It would make sense that any instantiation within reality or nature could not deviate therefrom, because there'd be nothing for it to deviate towards. So that would also help provide a framework for that isomorphism. Thus, they form a control language through which nature regulates its self-instantiations. This control language is not of the usual kind, for it is somehow built into the very fabric of reality, and seems to override the known limitations of formal systems. Moreover, it is profoundly reflexive and self-contained with respect to configuration, execution, and read-write operations. Only the few and the daring have been willing to consider how this might work, to ask where in reality the laws might reside, how they might be expressed and implemented, why and how they came to be, and how their consistency and universality are maintained. Although these questions are clearly of great scientific interest, science alone is logically inadequate to answer them. A new explanatory framework is required. This paper describes what the author considers to be the most promising framework in the simplest and most direct terms possible. On a note of forbearance, there has always been discomfort in the belief that the standard hybrid empirical mathematical methods of physics and cosmology will ultimately suffice to reveal the true heart of nature. However, there have been numerous signals that it may be time to try a new approach. With true believers undaunted by the mathematically factual, explanatory limitations of the old methods, we must of course empathize. It is hard to question one's prior investments when one has already invested all the faith one has. But science and philosophy do not progress by regarding their past investments as ends in themselves. The object is always to preserve that which is valuable in the old methods while adjoining new methods that refine their meaning and extend their horizons. The new approach that we will be exploring in this paper, which might be colorfully rendered as reality theory is wedded to language theory and they beget a synthesis, has the advantage that it leaves the current picture of reality virtually intact. It merely creates a logical mirror image of the current picture, its conspansive dual, merges the symmetric halves of the resulting picture, and attempts to extract meaningful implications. Science, as we now know it, is thereby changed but little in return for what may, if fate smiles upon us, turn out to be vast gains in depth, significance, and explanatory power. And on that note, I thank you for your kind attention and wish you a fruitful journey. So sweet. All right. On theories, models, and false dichotomies. It has almost become embarrassing to point out that science is in a state of crisis, not because it is untrue, but because it has become a cliché too often accompanied by little or no remedial insight. For all of the magnificent achievements of science, its grander ambitions long ago succeeded in taxing its traditional models and organizational principles beyond their explanatory limits. In the search for ever deeper and broader explanations, science has reached the point at which it can no longer deny the existence of intractable conceptual difficulties devolving to the explanatory inadequacies of its fundamental conceptual models of reality. This has spawned a new discipline known as reality theory, the study of the nature of reality in its broadest sense. The overall goal of reality theory is to provide new models and new paradigms in terms of which reality can be understood, and the consistency of science restored as it deepens and expands in scope. Mainstream reality theory counts among its hotterfocki the interpretation of quantum theory and its reconciliation with classical physics, the study of subjective consciousness and its relationship to objective material reality, the reconciliation of science and mathematics, complexity theory, cosmology, and related branches of science, mathematics, philosophy, and theology. But in an integrated sense, it is currently in an exploratory mode, being occupied with the search for a general conceptual framework in which to develop a more specific theory and model of reality capable of resolving the paradoxes and conceptual inconsistencies plaguing its various fields of interest, where a model is technically defined as a valid interpretation of a theory in its universe of reference. Because of the universal scope of reality theory, it is subject to unique, if seldom recognized, demands. For example, since it is, by definition, a universal theory of everything that is real, it must by definition contain its rules of real-world interpretation. That is, reality theory must contain its own model and affect its own self-interpretive mapping thereto. It must conform to the implications of this requirement. This self-modeling is a primary criterion for the required framework. The ranks of reality theorists include researchers from almost every scientific discipline. As the physical sciences have become more invested in a quantum mechanical view of reality, and as science in general has become more enamored of and dependent on computer simulation as an experimental tool, the traditional continuum models of classical physics has gradually lost ground to a new class of models to which the concepts of information and computation are essential. Called discrete models, they depict reality in terms of bits, quanta, quantum events, computational operations, and other discrete, recursively related units. Whereas continuum models are based on the notion of a continuum, a unified extensible whole with one or more distance parameters that can be infinitely subdivided in such a way that any two distinct points are separated by an infinite number of intermediate points, discrete models are distinguished by realistic acknowledgement of the fact that it is impossible to describe or define a change or separation in any way that does not involve a sudden finite jump in some parameter. Unfortunately, the advantages of discrete models, which are receiving increasingly serious consideration from the scientific and philosophical communities, are outweighed by certain basic deficiencies. Not only do they exhibit scaling and non-locality problems associated with their display hardware, but they are inadequate by themselves to generate the conceptual infrastructure required to explain the medium, device, or array in which they evolve, or their initial states and state transition programming. Moreover, they remain anchored in materialism, objectivism, and Cartesian dualism, each of which has proven obstructive to the development of comprehensive explanation of reality. Materialism arbitrarily excludes the possibility that reality has a meaningful non-material aspect, Objectivism arbitrarily excludes the possibility that reality has a meaningful subjective aspect, and although Cartesian dualism technically excludes neither, it arbitrarily denies that the mental and material, or subjective and objective, sides of reality share in a common substance. One might almost get the impression that the only two available choices are the classical model, to which quantum theory has been fastened with approximately the same degree of cogency as antlers on a jackrabbit, and the newer discrete models, which purport to be more in line with quantum theory, but fall by the wayside en route to the new kind of quantum cosmology they portentously seem to promise. For such claims exhibit an unmistakable irony. Classical reality is precisely that on which information and computation are defined. Like classical reality itself, a well-defined entity, unable to account for its own genesis, information, and computation, are well-defined and non-self-generative aspects of reality, as it is observationally presented to us at an advanced stage of its existence. So they invite the same questions as does classical reality. How and by what were they originally defined and generated? Without an answer to this question, little can be gained by replacing one kind of reality with the other. Yeah, so it seems to be more lack of final causation, or at least a similar issue.
Hey, ours really quick. I was wondering if you could clarify what Langan means, or exactly what the problem is with cognition and matter.
Can you elaborate your question?
Yeah, earlier in the document, maybe I can find it. Well, he talks about like coupling the two, right? And that's what like the one is, or God ultimately is. It like the information is the same as the rendering, right? I'm not actually sure.
Oh! When he says infocognition, should I pull that up? That's probably
sure.
That's probably a good one to pull up.
Yeah.
Infocognition.
Here it is in the introduction, I think. The relationship between physical and informational reductionism is a telling one, for it directly mirrors Cartesian mind-matter dualism. I think it's this section here.
Okay, wait. Is that on, which page is that on?
That is on the second page.
Okay, let's see. Which paragraph? Is it the first paragraph?
The
yes.
Paragraph.
Oh, second paragraph. Okay. The relationship between physical and informational reductionism is a telling one. For it. Oh, yeah. So what I was saying about that is if we just like thought of like, okay, this microphone, computer, and mouse as, instead of stuff units organized together, rather just like information units, this in itself is kind of like the same thing in essence. You know what I mean? Without like actually having something immaterial, how you can understand this is if you can kind of keep the essence of materialism and simply slightly alter its definition, in that instead of it being like stuff bits, it's like bits of information, which I would say is more accurate, of course. And I think Chris Langan is kind of referring to that too, that it's kind of accurate, but it's not getting to the heart of the problem. It's not getting to like any final cause. But if you were to leave it there, it's a lot like materialism, because it would be you're predicating that reality is still essentially composed of like bits of stuff. It's just no longer atoms. It's just like material, or informational bits. Well, I mean, that ultimately is
information.
Yeah. Ultimately, that is like what the nature of matter kind of is, more closely, in my opinion. But it's not contextualizing it fully as a dynamic process or operation of the mind. That's the problem I would personally have with like leaving it at like just a replacement of like matter stuff, like corpuscular theory, with the same thing, but calling it information. But let's read infocognition. It's actually not exactly the same part, but it might touch on this a little bit. And it'll be just a good one to have. Okay, Langan begins by recognizing the pioneering work of physicist John Wheeler, who he will mention quite a bit later on, and that'll be pretty interesting, who united the world of information theory with quantum mechanics, its from bits, which will probably also look up itself, because every time I read about it, I kind of just forget. All things physical are information theoretic in origin, and this is a participatory universe. Observer participancy gives rise to information, and information gives rise to physics. In How Come Existence, John Wheeler wrote, "No escape is evident from 4 conclusions. The world cannot be a giant machine ruled by any pre-established continuum physical law. There is no such thing at the microscopic level as space or space-time continuum. The familiar probability function or functional and wave equation or functional wave equation of standard quantum theory provide mere continuum idealizations, and by reason of this circumstance conceal the information theoretic source from which they derive." Hey, yeah, that kind of seems to be close to what I said. 4. No element in the description of physics shows itself as closer to primordial than the elementary quantum phenomenon, that is, the elementary device intermediated act of posing a yes-no physical question and eliciting an answer, or in brief, the elementary act of observer participancy. Man, I don't know who all was here, but this actually reminds me of a call. I know Metanoia was in there with Arval, and he was talking about queries, and actually got into a lot of stuff like this. Like how a lot of... he was talking about wave function collapse would basically happen based on the answer of a query, and that would also generate like new information. That would collapse the potential of superposition into a position, so to speak. Okay. Interesting. Otherwise stated, every physical quantity, every it, derives its ultimate significance from bits, binary yes-no indications, a conclusion which we epitomize in the phrase it from bit. The CTMU builds upon this work by retooling the information concept to incorporate reflexive self-processing in a reality-theoretic context so as to make it self-transducing information. Where information and cognition are recursively interdefined, their nexus point is infocognition. Okay, let me reread that, actually. Retooling the information concept to incorporate reflexive self-processing in a reality-theoretic context so as to make it self-transducing information. Okay. Where information and cognition are recursively interdefined, their nexus point is infocognition. A quantum of infocognition is a syntactic operator or a nuion. I'm going to pronounce it that. Okay, yeah. Nuisis. Nuion. Nuion. Not going to read all this. Actually, yeah, okay. Well, I'm trying to skim through to see like what of this is like the best to read, so bear with me. Okay, because cognition and generic information transduction are identical up to isomorphism. Okay, so the transduction of information. After all, cognition is just the specific form of information processing that occurs in a mind. Information processing can be described as generalized cognition, and the coincidence of information and processor can be referred to as infocognition. Okay. Reality thus consists of a single substance, infocognition, with 2 aspects corresponding to transduction and being transduced. So it's kind of like the agent and its operation, or the operator and its operation. The thing and what it does is kind of what I'm getting from this. Describing reality as infocognition thus amounts to infocognitive dual aspect monism. Monism. Whoopsie, it's monism. where infocognition equals the distributed, generalized self-perception and self-cognition of reality. Infocognitive monism implies a stratified form of panpsychism. So panpsychism is all is mindism, or all is soulism. Well, yeah, no, people take it as all is mindism, basically, in which at least 3 levels of self-cognition can be distinguished with respect to scope, power, and coherence: global, agentive, and subordinate. All right, I think that kind of answers the question of infocognition. Does anyone have any thoughts on that before I try to figure out where I left off?
Yeah, well, it's a monism, and it's dual aspect because of the cognition and the thing that is being cognized, right? But it's
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
Yeah, that like I think he mentions that too. He specifically mentions the subject and the object.
Right.
I think like a couple pages ago.
Yeah, so like in terms of like subject object, you can think of I don't know if this sounds like Ken Wheelery. I'm actually not sure if he uses the term self-objectification. Usually he says disobjectification. Okay, let's not get it twisted here. I might have made up self-objectification. I'm not sure. Self-objectification would be like the cognizing of information or the operation of the subject, and the object would kind of be the product of the operation. So I would almost say that making it like a tripartite theory, just in my opinion, maybe it's redundant. It probably is redundant, but taking the operator, operation, and the object, like the way I think of metaphysics generally is I will take because I'm certainly an idealist, so I'll take the mind, and it intrinsically contains its own active power, its capacity to think, and also to contain images of its thought, or I guess this could be considered perception of its thought or cognition of its thought, kind of apprehension of the object of its thought after the operation is, complete, so to speak. But that object would not be reified into. So that's why he considers it a duality, because he had like similar thought, because the object or the information. Well, yeah, I guess he kind of just labels it information. Wouldn't necessarily have to be reified into like or given ontological status, but let's continue on here. Let's see.
and that would be because it's a part of the operation, so it doesn't need to be reified because it's really
I would say
arbitrary,
yeah, it's because how can I explain this? It wouldn't need to be reified into being itself. And in fact, the operation itself wouldn't need to be reified because it's simply the operation of, let's say, being or a mind. So, like, if mind or being is what truly was, then what being does also wouldn't have ontological status because it's posterior to being, and so would the objects of its operation, even though they're perceived. So it has some form of existence that just has to be contextualized in the context or in reference to what actually does exist. But that's kind of that probably would part a little with Chris Langan, because thinking about it, yeah, seems kind of obvious, but he does put information and cognition as the kind of, or infocognition as the monic principle. And I would say that could be valid because if you, even, relative to what I just said, because you could take the information prior to its cognizing or its being cognized as still being mapped off of something that is ontologically real, true, and definite, or principally true, kind of like Plato's forms being kind of like the primary, not like actual objects of reality that are cognized, but more like kind of the metastructure of reality. And metastructure is a good term that Chris Langan, I think he came up with it, actually. And yeah, I think metastructure is a really good way to understand the forms too, especially because Plato's theory of forms is like without some like good metaphysical grounding, there's a lot of like really kind of just basic, not good interpretations of it. But yeah, I'll continue off on. Okay, actually, I'll go back a little bit just because it's been a bit. As the physical sciences have become more invested in a quantum mechanical view of reality, and as science in general has become more enamored of and dependent on computer simulation as an experimental tool, the traditional continuum model of classical physics has gradually lost ground to a new class. Wait, did I read a bunch of this already? Yes, I did. Okay, whoopsie. I don't want to go over too much or reread too much. Okay, moreover, they remain anchored in... Wait, no, I was all the way down here. Okay, all over the place. We will go ahead and reread this whole paragraph, though. One might almost get the impression that the only two available choices are the classical model to which quantum theory has been fastened with approximately the same degree of cogency as antlers on a jackrabbit, and the newer discrete models which purport to be more in line with quantum theory but fall by the wayside en route to the new kind of quantum cosmology they portentously seem to promise. For such claims exhibit an unmistakable irony. Classical reality is precisely that on which information and computation are defined. And I'm realizing that I read a bunch of this already, but we'll just go with it. Like classical reality itself, a well-defined entity unable to account for its own genesis, information, and computation are well-defined and non-self-generative aspects of reality as it is observationally presented to us at an advanced stage of its existence. So they invite the same questions as does classical reality. How and by what were they originally defined and generated? Without an answer to this question, little can be gained by replacing one kind of reality with the other. Some may have felt, as they watched the history of big theories and new paradigms unfold over the last few years, as though they were being forced to watch the same show or read the same novel, 1,000 times in tedious succession with no more than an occasional minor revision of plot or character. However, there is a third alternative, which has thus far remained in the background. It provides exactly what is required in light of any thesis and antithesis, synthesis. This synthesis yields a new class of models, preserving the best features of both thesis and antithesis, continuum and quantum, uniting them through general and preferably self-evident principles. This paper presents this new class through a single example: the cognitive theoretic model of the universe. All right, and we'll go ahead and get into this. Probably won't get too far into this. But yeah, alright, determinacy, indeterminacy, and the third option. Like the mathematics, science, and philosophy whence they issue, classical continuum and modern discrete models of reality generally allow for exactly two modes of determinacy: external causality and acausality, or randomness. Given an object, event, set, or process, it is usually assumed to have come about in one or both of just two ways. 1. Its existence owes to something prior and external to it. 2. It is uncaused and sprang forth spontaneously and pointlessly in a something-from-nothing, rabbit-out-of-the-hat sort of way, as if by magic. A similar assumption is made with regard to its behavior. Either it is controlled by laws that are invariant with respect to it, and therefore existentially external to it, even though they control it through its intrinsic nature and properties, or it is behaving in an utterly aleatory and uncontrolled fashion. This has given rise to a dichotomy, determinacy versus randomness, or a total absence of causation versus causation by laws that are ultimately independent of the determined entity. Determinacy and indeterminacy, at first glance, there seems to be no middle ground. Events are either causally connected or they are not, and if they are not, then the future would seem to be utterly independent of the past. Either we use causality to connect the dots and draw a coherent picture of time, or we settle for a random scattering of independent dots without spatial or temporal pattern, and thus without meaning. At the risk of understatement, the philosophical effects of this dichotomy have been corrosive in the extreme. No universe that exists or evolves strictly as a function of external determinacy randomness, or an alteration or alternation of the two can offer much in the way of meaning. Whereas freedom and volition are irrelevant, so is much of human experience and individuality. But there is another possibility after all: self-determinacy. Self-determinacy is like a circuitous boundary separating the poles of the above dichotomy, a reflexive and therefore closed boundary, the formation of which involves neither pre-existing laws nor external structure. Thus, it is the type of causal attribution suitable for a perfectly self-contained system. Self-determinacy is a deep but subtle concept, owing largely to the fact that unlike either determinacy or randomness, it is a source of bona fide meaning. Where a system determines its own composition, properties, and evolution independently of external laws or structures, it can determine its own meaning and ensure by its self-configuration that its inhabitants are crucially implicated therein. All right. And there are some graphs scattered throughout. Those are exciting, right? Diagram 1, you have indeterminacy. Okay, let's see. No. Just a dot. Okay, then you have external determinacy. Very linear. Then you have self-determinacy, which has this kind of, I'm going to take the blue to represent kind of agency, circling back on itself to determine itself. Then you have intrinsic self-determinacy, wherein, okay, let's take the dot in the center to represent indeterminacy, and then the kind of function, or the pointing to as the determination. I'll take the indeterminate factor here that's being synthesized as the free will, or the agency. And I take, I don't actually want to talk too much before he like fully goes off on kind of how I interpret it, but I really like his idea of intrinsic self-determinacy. It helped explain some stuff with Leibniz last week, because there seem to be contradictions in Leibniz, his discourse on metaphysics, wherein he basically seems to acknowledge free will, but then say that, you know, every future event is exactly determined. Like if you were to look at someone's current condition, it would show exactly the future events that condition will partake in, or the being inhabiting that condition will partake in. He used like Caesar or Alexander as an example of that. But self-determinacy is interesting because it can preserve that kind of logical determinacy and incorporate it helps with God's free will and actually emanationism. Like, let's take Platonic emanationism, which kind of holds that reality, lower reality or posterior reality to the like base reality principle, or everything posterior to the one, is kind of a necessary emanation therefrom, as opposed to a kind of creationism, which would stipulate that everything posterior to the base reality principle is kind of arbitrary and it could have been completely different. Rather that, say, like nous, the world soul, and then the plural souls would all be like intrinsically necessary, but logically posterior to the one. But that some form of agency would already be included in that base reality principle. So, for instance, God would have like a way that he is that would mean that, like if God had some kind of hyper mathematical structure or metastructure, reality is not going to deviate from that. It'd be impossible. But that agency is already accounted for therein. And therefore, you know, by way of self-reference, which would be necessary in a self-contained system, souls would also have a degree of free will, although heavily, maybe not predicated on the conditions they're inhabiting, but just generally informed by those conditions, whereas God himself would be unconditioned, not limited to any particular condition, but also containing all of the souls that are inhabiting conditions. Let me get some water. Any thoughts on determinacy thus far?
No, I was going to say though we're about to get into the whole John Archibald Wheeler little arc of
Yeah,
the
that's
CTMU, which is like a whole thing in itself. So
it is, yeah. Let's see. Okay, I think this is actually a good place to leave off. It's kind of it's almost a little bit worrying that we only got 5 pages in, but not
well,
too.
yeah, it's dense stuff.
It's pretty dense, and we'll
You have to go
definitely.
through and explain all the like neologisms and
Yeah, and I think it's worth taking the time to do that. Some of this will probably go by
oh
faster
yeah,
than other parts, but yeah.
and you'll probably want to remember to bring up the page on infocognition again when we get into the John Archibald Wheeler
Yeah.
saga.
Yeah. If you're watching this on YouTube, I haven't uploaded like 2 last Leibniz videos. That's okay. If you're watching this on YouTube and you want to join one of these reading groups, go ahead and DM me on Twitter or Instagram at metamundanity. And thank you for watching.